My name is Heidi Campbell. I'm an associate professor of communication here at Texas A&M, and my area of research is looking at the intersection of new media, religion, and digital culture. And I also run the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Cultural Studies. And today I'm going to be looking at the broad idea of alternative facts and digital religion. But specifically, I'm hoping to kind of focus in on a couple of research projects that I've been working on with a team of people here at Texas A&M. And so I'm calling the subtitle of this talk is looking at reading truth in digital culture through internet memes. And so memes have become a very popular form of social media communication, trying to communicate humor and popular culture, and most recently, a lot of interesting ideas about politics, about truth, and about popular culture and religious culture. And what we're looking at in this particular study is looking at how meaning gets negotiated, especially through digital culture, and what's called participatory culture. So participatory culture is a concept that's been kind of developed by Henry Jenkins in his work, and he looks at participatory culture as the way that new media and digital technologies allows for this co-creative space to be created through network technologies. So it's a culture that is characterized by collaboration, it's characterized by sharing, it's characterized by virality, and it creates a lot of new dimensions about how do we kind of understand how people read text, how do we understand how people create text, and what does this mean for especially public conversation. Another key concept that I'm going to be kind of talking about today is the idea of the network public. And this is a concept that Mimi Ito and Dana Boyd and others have looked at, and looking at how a public is formed, especially through digital technology, how it is bounded together, and how those conversation spaces create meaning that not just interprets different ideas or news events, but also kind of can be sources of accountability. So what I really want to kind of show through these research studies that we've been doing at A&M is how meaning is being negotiated and the challenges about how do we understand and interpret meaning, especially through the lens of religion and politics when they intersect in meme culture. So let me kind of define some of the key terms and concepts of the study. So first, we're studying internet memes, and internet memes are these visual artifacts that have popular culture images. Sometimes they're from movies, sometimes they're from people that have just kind of become popular internet social media heroes or figures, and then evocative sayings are often tied to them. And these become artifacts that circulate around the internet and people use for humor, but also for really poignant discussions. Limor Schiffman is one of the leading researchers looking at the area of internet memes and what it has to say about digital and also religious and political culture. She defines memes as multi-participant creative expressions through which cultural, political, and religious identities are communicated and negotiated. So one of the great things about memes is that these are texts that are, they are not authorless, but it's very hard to kind of find the author. And so in some ways, truth or meaning is in the eye of the beholder. One meme that can be used from a picture and a different evocative slogan that can be put together in one context can be used to kind of support and encourage a certain idea, and another way it becomes an important and maybe even a poignant tool for critique. And so memes are, as Beller et al. In their study on especially religious internet memes, found these memes to be highly visual and emotive forms of communication. They're working on trying to get a reaction out of people. They're employing a lot of popular culture images that are coming either directly out of digital culture or especially out of celebrity culture, and it's a fake message to communicate a certain kind of meaning. So what this means is that when we're looking at these internet memes, we're looking at one area of where media and where digital culture is creating new forms of understanding and new understandings of truth. These memes are based on, you have to have some skills in a couple number of areas. First is you have to be fluent in kind of popular culture and in a specific popular culture context. So looking at the memes at the bottom of the screen, we can see these are memes that kind of emerged, especially when the term alternative facts became popular in the press and was talked about by Sean Spicer and others. And looking at kind of how that they're taking popular images from newsreels, and mixing them with kind of phrases. So So you have to have this fluency of like what is that person representing as an icon or image, and what is happening in the contemporary culture. You also have to understand digital culture and how it functions. And so Lamore Schiffman in her work has found there's a couple traits of memes that we need to understand. First is memes communicate through viral sociality. So A, they are about something, there has to be an image and a saying that can be easily spread through culture and the internet. So in some ways that means there has to technologically, they have to kind of be a kind of a certain kind of file that can be easily shared via social media or texting. So there's a technological element, but there also has to be a conversational or communal element. They have to have an image, they have to have a phrase that can be easily identified and translatable. But because of the social aspect, it depends on the group that basically is reading that text. So it's a social element that means this idea can communicate it, it has longevity, it can be spread, but it also can be interpreted in different cultures and contexts. And so memes, Lamore Schiffman says, have a hypermedia logic, or what Jenkins would call a transmedia logic. This means that they draw on one media context and allowing that that media platform or that media franchise to basically expand into other places. So you have to understand kind of how these memes get constructed and how these memes, you can take an image and change one or two words on that particular slide or artifact and completely change the meaning. And so unlike some technologies where if you have access to a platform like Know Your Meme or create memegenerator.com, through just in less than 60 seconds, you can not only create a meme, but you can change the meaning of a meme. Another important trait of internet memes is that they essentialize meaning. So how do they work? Well, they work on the basis of kind of broad assumptions and often stereotypes. So they're boiling down political arguments to the kind of what the common assumptions or often biases that people have. They're boiling down religion to kind of sometimes the outsider perspective of what are the key traits of that religious perspective. And so they often don't do well with nuance. And this is where, again, a lot of tension and a lot of challenges have when we interpret them, because these meanings, they kind of gloss over some of the kind of nuances that are important to understand, especially in political debates. And finally, memes reflect this idea of remixing culture. So they're not only just remixing digital culture and different kinds of text together, they're remixing different ways of communicating. They're working with humor in certain kind of contexts. They're working with certain kind of popular assumptions. And they're also working with a new level of literacy of basically how memes use humor as a form of critique, as a form of kind of public accountability. Also, when we read memes, we need to keep in mind that they use different forms of humor, and some of the most dominant forms of humor sometimes is playfulness, such as we see in the Conway meme here of it's an alternative fax machine, just push here. The idea of kind of, it's making fun, but trying to do it in a not so kind of maybe harmful or overly critical way. Sometimes they use incongruity and irony. Sometimes it's superiority, i.e. kind of saying the person who created the meme is trying to say my ideas are more superior than others. Such as we see in the Spicer meme, we have the right to disagree with facts, think about what he just said. Or parody mimicry, just as we're in this Trump meme where we see he's kind of being played out to be Pinocchio. Is he telling the truth or not? So that's one of the starting points of our research. The second one is just the concept of digital religion. So we're looking at memes of how they talk about religion, and especially religion and politics together. So two important kind of points to keep in mind. What is digital religion? Well, digital religion is an area of study that looks at how online and offline religious beliefs, practices, and cultures are being interconnected. So to what extent when people talk about religion, practice religion, or engage with kind of what is the religious, especially popular, dominant religious ideals, how is offline and online connected? And to what extent are those spaces being either bridged, blended, or blurred? So we're talking about different kind of variations of how much they're integrated or maybe adverse to one another. Another important point about digital religion is that what we're seeing in how people talk about religion, within religious studies we talk about different kind of frames, and digital religion can be seen as what religious studies scholars call lived religion. So this means that people are looking at religion that's not coming how it's defined by a particular group, or an institution, it's looking at how people actually live religion in their everyday lives. So they might subscribe to a certain religious tradition, i.e. I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, and when they speak, they might be seen to be speaking for that particular tradition, but that's being filtered through a series of lenses of their own cultural experience, the contemporary context they find themselves in. And so what we need to understand about these practices or these performances of religion through means that while they may espouse or seem to espouse a broad perspective, they're really coming from a specific community and a specific viewpoint. So digital religion is looking at how contemporary media and digital culture are now providing these important resources where people can create spiritual meaning in their lives. And in this context, debate about how religion and politics intersect and become tools for interpretation and interaction. So this research project is situated at Texas A&M and under the work of what I call the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Culture Studies. This is an interactive research website for scholars, students, and the press and journalists. People who are interested in looking at how religion is performed online and how people are studying and researching this. And part of this project, I basically have been turning my students at Texas A&M into research teams, not only teaching them how to study digital media and analyze visual text, but also how to read religion in these digital contexts and how to kind of see how these internet memes are enacting certain kind of beliefs and creating certain kind of debates. So in this slide, you'll see here's a class blog from my religious communication class where the students were blogging on different case studies about religious memes. Another is an example of a student work where he was basically creating an online research diary. He was studying religious political memes, especially Trump memes related to the election. A group of my honor students that had turned their research studies from that particular class on religion and politics into a published article that we're sending out for review. So I'm working with these students to kind of, and also leveraging their kind of fluency in digital culture and popular culture to help me understand some of these kind of memes that are being produced and kind of what the popular assumptions would be behind them. And so we've created together a collaborative database where the students, we've kind of logged over 175 different memes that are kind of different identifiable artifacts where religion is being talked about and religion and politics. So you may see images like Advice God or Advice Jesus or Atheist Adam. These are kind of characters that have emerged that if you go to knowyourmeme.com, there's a certain picture associated with a certain usually kind of language or phrase that are associated with these memes, and some of these memes are used to kind of, again, extend superiority. Some are being playful, but different discourses about religion in that context. So I want to share two short, brief findings that we found in our research, and then what that has to say about how we interpret, especially reading what is factual and what is truth in digital culture through internet memes. So in the first study that I did with students, we were looking specifically at how do we read religion in internet memes. And what we found through a study of over 250 memes is that there's several different popular genres or dominant genres of memes that are being produced. There's religious stock characters. So if in meme culture you may have come across condescending Wonka or awkward Adam or other kind of characters, condescending Wonka, like you'll see here, he is usually, or this is Gene Wilder from the movie Willy Wonka, and he's always asking this kind of provocative question. So here's, oh, so you're a Christian. Please tell me more about how godly you are. So these memes are kind of trying to evoke a certain kind of questioning thing. We also have kind of some religious figure memes that are emerging. Some of these could be like the Pope, or we can see an example here of this is a popular Storytime Jesus. It's an image coming from a children's Sunday school literature, and he's always kind of, Jesus is always kind of telling one of the parable stories, but also kind of challenging kind of maybe in a playful way kind of cultural ideas. We also found spoof and implicit religious memes. There's more there than we can have time to talk about. But what was really core from this research is by looking at these are the kind of memes that are used, these are the kind of images that are used, we found that there were some dominant ways that religion gets talked about in many of these popular culture memes. We found these frames of sometimes religion is mocked, sometimes religion is played with, and especially from maybe someone inside the tradition trying to show the positive aspects of religion. Sometimes it's used to kind of promote either specific beliefs or specific practices. Other times it's where an outsider of the community is trying to question it. And there's a lot of also religious tropes and stereotyping. In our first study, what we found is actually most of the memes were either questioning religion or being playful. And so for here, it's kind of like we see here on the end, we see Velociraptor saying, if God is against adultery, why did he have a child with a married woman? So here you see that they're using a tool of kind of how do we kind of in a questioning way kind of critique maybe some popular teachings or assumptions about religion. We also find kind of the playful, the hey girl memes where, hey, a Proverbs 21 woman is more precious than rubies. Well, then how about a diamond? So religion in these memes and in meme culture is getting talked about, but in many ways in kind of a way that could be used either positively or as a tool of critique. So it becomes this potential double-edged sword depending on the meanings associated. And so in the last year, we've been extending that to look at, okay, if we add politics in the mix, how do we understand how religious memes that are centered around politics work? And what's the difference here? So in taking a study of 150 memes that emerged around between September and November around the presidential elections, students in my Com 480 class began to analyze what were the core topics in these memes and what were some of the core messages. Well, one of the most interesting things is that when religion and politics get mixed together, we move from a questioning frame to mocking being the dominant kind of narrative. Religion is being mocked. And what is being mocked? Well, the meme subjects primarily focused on in our sample was memes that showed a contradictory within the ideals of Christian conservative voters, and especially self-proclaimed Christian candidates like Donald Trump or Ted Cruz. So in other words, memes that we're talking about religion and politics in this specific context, we're really kind of highlighting, well, this is what conservative voters say that might have a religious angle to it, or this is what Christians who associate with that particular perspective, but maybe what are the incongruencies that actually what they say and maybe what they do, or what they say and maybe judged against a broader perspective. So here Condescending Wonka is saying, so you say that you're a Christian and you're supporting Donald Trump? Please tell me more about how those two aren't contradictory, and really starting to critique Trump and how he presents his kind of character and the inconsistencies. And this being highlighted in this meme about Donald Trump. I don't read the Bible very often, but when I do, I read 2 Corinthians. Well, what's controversial about that? Well, if they're part of the Christian community, that it's not 2 Corinthians, it's 2 Corinthians. So this meme is relying on insider knowledge to kind of make its joke, but it's also kind of critiquing, some of the public quotes, which quote Trump was trying to perform as a Christian, but was inconsistent in that. So where is the truth in that? Where is that at? Well, what this begins to tell us is that religion and politics, the internet memes, becomes this really interesting place of not just critique, but of public accountability, of people judging and using it to evaluate. And so, in a way to kind of come to an end, what we again found through this particular study is that what the kind of religion that's emerging in this discourse is what we call civil religion. It's not religion that's from a tradition. It's not even the practice of how everyone negotiates their faith. It's very much a nationalistic form of religion. So what religion is being preached at is a form of national religion that leans toward the conservative viewpoint, that is kind of basically saying this is what Christianity really stands for, but then is really kind of rubs the wrong way against especially people coming from a more progressive liberal background or from a more social justice perspective. So when religion and politics mix in these internet memes, it creates this active and passive dissidence. So we see this kind of conflict. And why is there this conflict of truth and meaning? It's because they're selling it as this is the one viewpoint, but actually it's from one specific group that is being advocated. And we can see this specifically in the, this meme at the bottom. This is Republican Jesus. So we have a traditional picture of Jesus with a Sacred Heart, and then we have Jesus with a American flag headband and the Republican National Committee. There, the symbol. Jesus, what would he do? He would feed the hungry and the sick, take care of the homeless. But Republican Jesus would cut food stamps, cut affordable health care, demonize the homeless. And so saying that, okay, we're not presenting with Jesus, we're presenting a certain version of Jesus. And so especially kind of highlighting how different candidates' intents and public images definitely can be critiqued because they're coming from one perspective rather than a broad perspective. So overall, we see memes, they function on assumptions of essential and absolute ideas, and that's highly problematic. That participatory culture, this place where memes are created, and that it challenges the idea of who is the author and how is the text understood. But finally, meaning is negotiated in these network publics. And one of the great things about memes is not only is it kind of exposing certain dominant stereotypes or dominant assumptions, that there's a public out there that are reading these that kind of can basically hold people accountable in when they're interpreting them in one particular way from one particular perspective that may be seen as problematic from other groups in that religious tradition or political tradition. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Sandra Braman. I'm Abbott Professor of Liberal Arts and Professor of Communication at Texas A&M University. My field of study is information policy, that is laws and regulations for any form of information creation, processing, flows, and use. Thought of that more broadly as the macro level effects of digital technologies and their policy implications. Asking that question means we're looking at the co-construction of law, society, and technology. I'll be looking at what we might do with the law as we try to deal with fake news and the nature of facticity in the digital environment. But first, wanted to comment in response to a couple of tweets from John Chambers early on during Heidi Campbell's talk, asking about the difference between spin and post-truth, and asked a couple of wonderful questions about scale and economics as dimensions along which we might distinguish. I would have a lot to say about that. Don't have time today, but just wanted to mention that spin, that these questions are on a spectrum of relationship to the truth, if we think of that as empirical realities. Spin would simply have to do with a particular perspective or framing on things that actually are facts. You get from there to error, to falsity, to deliberate falsity on out. But when we're talking about post-truth, we're really talking about an environment in which the truth actually doesn't matter at all anymore. So that's how I would distinguish those. The question I want to talk about is how under U.S. law we can restrict, punish, or prevent the attack on facticity in the digital environment via fake news. Facticity has actually been a running stream in my research since the mid-1980s. But we certainly have in what's being called fake news a reason to really focus on it right now. One thing we want to remember is that epistemological crises historically over a long period typically arise during periods of enormous political crisis. And certainly we're seeing that today. So what I want to do today is just briefly talk about what we mean by facticity, look at what's happening to it in the digital environment, what fake news is as a legal problem, and then we actually have about half a dozen options under U.S. law that could be pursued for trying to get a hold of it. So by facticity, we mean cultural orientation revolving around the fact, whether towards or away, meaning we're claiming to be fact or we're claiming to be fiction. We have specific social functions for narrative forms that present themselves as factual, like journalism or science. We have detailed and verifiable procedures by which facts are developed and evaluated, and institutional certification of information and information production processes as factual. These constitute the core of modernity, actually. The concept of the fact actually came from John Locke, 1690. There were 5 elements in his understanding of what we mean by the fact: the perceptual entity that experiences the world, expresses that experience in referential language, communicates that to others, and what has been presented as a fact becomes a subject of group discussion. I have published on how technology has affected each of these elements of Lockean facticity. That's on my website. You'll see at the end in full text. So I'll run through this quite quickly, but in terms of the perceptual entity, even Locke meant that things beyond biological individuals could be the perceptual entity generating facts, so that includes the state. It includes today artificial intelligence, network communities, and so on. In today's environment, the nature of that perceptual entity may be ephemeral, shifting, not known, not visible. May be a legal subject, may not be, and so forth. We have a whole history of theoretical approaches to thinking about how technology affects our ability to experience or perceive or understand facts, getting to the point where we are today that technology becomes the reality that is the subject of our facts. And we have what you might call an explosion of facts. That's a Clifford Geertz term in this environment, with the enormous explosion in the number of sensing technologies. By referentiality, in the sense at this point we could say hyperreality is real. That's the environment we're living in. We've gone through 4 different stages of thinking about what we mean by the information economy, beginning from just saying that traditional economic sectors, that certain forms of communication industries were more important relatively than they were previously. But the most recent, which began to appear in the 1990s, is the representational economy. In the representational economy, representations have replaced empirical realities as the foundation for our economic decision-making. So again, in reference to one of Chambers' comments about the economic impact on the value of truth. With big data, our sense of our confidence in actual empirical referentiality takes another big step down because we have abandoned provenance. We don't know where the data come from and who has been processing and holding it. Since then, we've lost confidence in reliability, and we have lost confidence in validity. Communication, everybody in this conference is going to know about changes in the nature of communication because of digital technology, and I'm going to assume also quite familiar with what's happened in terms of fragmentation of shared public venues for public decision-making, and so on. Other developments that are pertinent is that causality can be linear, nonlinear, as well as linear, and so forth. I'm going to move on into the legal crux of this. So fake news is a legal problem because it undermines both democracy and the rule of law. Democratic governments, by definition, must rely on facticity for decision-making and for their operations. There can be an impact on elections, as we unfortunately know. And the content of fake news undermines rule of law altogether in multiple ways I'd be happy to come back to. Fake news has served as incitement. Incitement is illegal. Use of speech to incite illegal violent action. Our president is currently engaged in a lawsuit charging him with incitement for actions and speech during his campaign. But incitement certainly heightens polarization among groups. It has literally provoked disruptive and violent actions by one group against another, and fake news contributes to that, making it something we can deal with legally. There's harm to individuals. Pizzagate, for those of you around the world, was the story about Hillary Clinton sexually abusing children in the back of some pizza parlor, and a guy actually went and shot up the pizza parlor as a result of that fake news story. So there's literal harm to individuals, which we can deal with under liability law. It's a legal issue from the perspective of access to information. Arguments put forward, claims put forward in fake news have been used as justifications restricting access to information. And we can go further. Environmental damage. If you are refusing to acknowledge scientific findings, that exacerbates global warming and other very serious environmental problems. We can say the same thing in the health arena. Refusing to take findings from medical research into account is damaging to health in a variety of ways, ranging from exposure to carcinogens in the environment to refusing to provide good nutrition for our youth. And certainly fake news is a legal issue from the perspective of impact on civil liberties. There are statutorily based slippages and requirements to rely upon the facts for purposes of determining subjects of surveillance and so on. And so this is quite a range of legal problems that fake news contributes to. So we actually have a number of options under U.S. law for dealing with this, despite common perceptions otherwise. Libel involves false assertions of fact the damage of a person's reputation. We can have a parallel in this, and we've already had a Supreme Court opinion, actually in 2012, that suggested we move down this path. The claim would be that false assertions of fact on matters of public concern that damage society could be criminalized. If we define fake news as false assertions of fact on matters of public concern that damage society, then we can look at fake news publications using criteria, analytical dimensions analogous to those we use with defamation. So you start with a judgment as to whether or not the story actually is true. We have fact-checking out there all over the place now, but you would use that, those findings legally. You can examine the procedures by which the stories are put together and look for negligence in the processes by which the stories were put forward, were created. You can examine motive, state of mind, whether that's actual malice, trying to undermine an election, or in some cases, the Macedonian fake news producers simply to make profit. And you can look at whether or not there was a willingness to issue a correction, to admit falsity once it is identified, which is important in many states in libel law. We can look at incitement. False assertions of fact are often linked to incitement. If we looked at the association of incitement with action, you could increase sentencing if convicted. We do this with hate crime in the United States. Hate crime is protected under the First Amendment as political speech, but if you act on it, then it is criminal and your sentences are doubled from what they would be if it were a criminal action without the hate speech. We could do that with fake news. Liability, physical harm to individuals, the Pizzagate example, we do have in U.S. communication law that we can hold content providers legally liable for harm that comes from those who receive instruction or inspiration on content, or if they imitate content in ways that harm others. Certainly, fake news is available for that. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, another tort under U.S. law that could be used with fake news. Racketeering and conspiracy. Under U.S. law, crimes that something can be criminal, like drug dealing or theft or fraud, but if that action is done multiple times, if it's repeated, if it's undertaken collaboratively, and it's undertaken across time and space, then it is a much more serious crime. We call it, it could be treated under racketeering or under conspiracy law, much more significant legal consequences. An easy way to think about it is the difference between how we treat the mafia relative to how we treat the teenage kid down the street who sells a few bags of marijuana. And there's false advertising. So under U.S. Advertising regulation, false assertions of fact, any assertion of fact in an advertisement must be based on sound, rigorous scientific evidence that was produced before the release of the advertisement. That's what we call truth in advertising. We, just last week, CNN refused to air Trump's television ad on his first 100 days because it includes falsities. It did not meet the truth in advertising criterion. So here's a regulatory tool that we can use. So despite the fact, as I say, that it is commonly assumed that we can't get a hold of this legally, I disagree. I'm yet to publish all of this material. This is actually my first exposure of it to the public. So I very much appreciate any comments or thoughts that you have via email or through any other means. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to Sandra and Heidi. I'm Laura Mandell, and I'm going to give the third presentation for our panel called Inadvertent Fake News, having to do with digital research and results. There was talk on an earlier panel of problems with algorithms, and that's where I'll begin. Sophia Noble has given some excellent presentations about the way that Google algorithms are skewed by bias. So when young Black women search for Black girls, they will actually be shown porn sites as top hits. Also, there are a team of researchers out of Xerox PARC that are working on big data. Maurice Hart has said that, in fact, machine learning is not fair or just in any meaningful way. It actually imbibes and regurgitates bias. In fact, Gillian Tett, who defended Chicago Police Department's use of profiling via an algorithm, had claimed this algorithm is completely neutral. And Maurice Hart points out that Tett is well known for having attacked that very algorithm when it was used in economics. So we might question how neutral it actually is. Sarah Hajian gave a presentation at Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, a conference organized by Hart. And in it, she mentioned some of the evidences of Google bias in algorithms. I think there are many, and I think people know them pretty well. But Google's algorithm shows prestigious job ads to men, but not to women. Flickr, when it had that horrible debacle of debuting its image recognition tools, had a whole bunch of apes tagged as Black people. Google image searches for CEO produced 11% women, even though 27% are women CEOs in the U.S. Another problem with algorithms is that their reliability depends highly on the sample size. This is, of course, horrible for minorities because the smaller the sample size, the more error an algorithm will perpetrate. Also, Cynthia Dwork and Hart have both talked about the problem of imposing statistical parity. It seems to be fairness, but in fact, it's preferential treatment. And Dwork gives a couple examples. If one society values, say, engineering and steers their smartest students toward that, and another culture values finance, the college admissions procedures selecting the best students will miss the best students in a particular culture. There's also a problem with data itself, and that's the main focus of my talk today, which is about inadvertent fake news. So Janet Hallowell has said that data is infrastructure, and what she means by that is that nothing functions without without very careful data collection and data cleaning and care. In fact, there is a rather famous woman who has published the fact that data is sexist, and that famous woman is Melinda Gates, who points out that data collection is skewed against both the poor and women, so that we just don't have data on certain groups. Marilyn Waring has talked about the way that organizations just ignore data that doesn't seem to matter to them. So the United Nations in 1993 claimed that they couldn't count household labor in order to determine how many women work worldwide. But the very same year, the International Labor Organization, in fact, did count self-sustaining households where women were working. It is countable, and I'll just point out that the UN said, oh, this is a compromise, but it takes account of most users. And of course, most users then don't care about women or poor people. So my main focus in my studies at the IDHMC has been historical data. We are producing a lot of articles and a lot of results of data mining and big data investigations. And I have this fear that in 100, 200 years from now, they'll look back and say, oh, those poor benighted people, they didn't realize that they actually weren't discovering any truths, just fake truths. One of the databases that I work with has metadata that identifies gender, and it did so in an automated way by using a dictionary of gendered names. And I wonder what it does with all of the Indian names in the data set. Also, again, data collection. Books were not printed by women and Anglo-African people in England. So in this data set, we don't have them. One of the most amazing productions, and it sort of is a little morality tale here. Chadwick-Healy came out with the most comprehensive, they claimed, database of English poetry available. And it came out in 1993, and at the time everybody thought, oh, this is new, it's the most comprehensive. If you look down at the editorial policy at the bottom there, you'll see that they used research from the NCBEL, which was published in 1970. The research was so old. It had three women writers in the 18th century in it. And just in case anybody's wondering, were there 18th century women poets? This is something that Roger Lonsdale answered in publishing an Oxford edition of them, and I'll just run through this very quickly. Here they are. So in terms of replicating in data sets prejudices that we already have, it's almost inevitable unless we actively work against doing so. One, a typical thing that we think about Google is, okay, well, you've got Google algorithms that have search problems, but at least the data in Google Books is neutral. This is the Google Ngram viewer, and you can see here a search in blue for the word sun, S-O-N, and it looks like people didn't really start talking about suns until around 1800. But if you look for fun, F-O-N, you'll see that they've been talking about them all along, and that's because the OCR running behind the Google Ngram viewer was not corrected. And in fact, if you searched for any term that could have an F or an S, profumption, presumption, case, cafe, they all, if I overlaid the searches, and they all intersected right around the time when the long S stopped being used. Well, the Google Ngram people fixed this, and the way they fixed it was, if you look at the bottom here of the Google Ngram viewer, you'll see there's dates, and you can click on the dates to see what texts were selected. Next time you use the Google Ngram viewer, do a search, look at those texts, and then search in Google Books as a whole. What they did is they just took out the text with dirty OCR, so you're not searching them anymore. That's how they fixed it. OCR in the early modern era is appalling, and you can see an example of the printed page images, which themselves have trouble, and of the OCR results, the mechanical typing of these texts, which is a huge problem for data miners and data of all sorts. So here's a wonderful new tool, the Text DNA tool. And what bad data does is it breaks any digital tool you can possibly use, or any digital algorithm you can possibly use. Here you can see it in one of the sequences, the words fought, animal, feed, duties, events, likely, oath, acts, aft, and then you come to conscience, and you realize, oh, that's conscience. Well, maybe aft is not a collective focus on the stern, but rather act. And maybe fought is thought. And suddenly we realize we don't know what we're seeing here. The Google Ngram viewer allows for searching words and deciding how often they've been used throughout time, their relative use. And so I searched here for 4: emotion, passion, sentiment, affection. This is percentage of those words appearing in the Ngrams. And so one question you might ask is, in 1900, weren't there just more varied texts that have been digitized? Because the early texts are probably classics of philosophy, for instance. Here is the same search in the HoneyTrust bookworm, and I searched for the exact same terms and got them lined up in terms of color, and you can see the trends are incredibly different. Again, there's a slope at the end, but that might be because there are more diversified materials in the data set as time goes on. We don't know whether we're seeing truths about history or truths about a particular data set. And here's an example of that. If I search for those 4 terms in a proprietary database called Artemis, I see that they're used and they get more and more used, and suddenly the usage plummets at 1800. Well, that's because their biggest data set that they allow searching on ends at 1800. There was just a drop in the number of texts that this tool was looking at. So we're seeing information about data. We're not seeing information about the world or history. Here I overlaid the Google Ngram results and the HoneyTrust book results, and you can see that while the word emotion seems to correspond in both sets, the word sentiment is completely different, one on the bottom, one on the top. Emotion has peaks in one while it has valleys in another. The same with sentiment. Its highest peak is at a valley in the other. So we cannot say, oh, sentiment was used widely in 1810. That would only be true for one data set, and we don't know why. The early modern OCR project at Texas A&M was designed to try to clean up data. We've had some results, but we are hoping that neural network technology is going to take us further. In working on this data, I was able to, by leveraging three sets of dirty OCR against each other, Echo, EMOP, and Google Echo is a proprietary catalog, to determine how many search items were missed when you do a search, when you search for a word, and what's running behind the search engine is mechanically typed text that's been typed incorrectly. You will get, if you search one catalog, Echo, only 57% of the possible results. If you search EMOP, you only get 40%. You miss 40% of the results. If you search the Google Ngram viewer, you miss 54% of the results. That suggests that any claims that scholars are making, working with these data sets and doing any kind of algorithmic analysis, whether it be search or something else, are just not true. They're inadvertent fake news. Thank you. So now we have time for questions, and I'm going to stop sharing our screen so that you can see us all up here. If people want to ask questions on the Twitter stream or propose things to say about it.
May I address one of the tweets that came through?
Please.
So Chelsea Mia made a couple of really interesting comments about asking whether or not media outlets that have been accused of publishing fake news might themselves file for libel. Yes, certainly you could. I think then you asked specifically about CNN. The question is when you're going to take the time and energy to do that in the barrage of all of the exhaustion of trying to keep up with the turbulence in our current news environment, but I wouldn't be surprised if legal departments are indeed thinking about that. So thank you for bringing it up.
I don't see people in digital humanities discussing data quality or using GIGO things, garbage in, garbage out. I agree with you, Mark. I think that's absolutely right. I think some of the most sophisticated data miners in my field do know and only use text that has been, hand transcribed, but most of them don't. And I feel profoundly that you get some results that just look ridiculous, and then people look at those results and think that data mining itself is ridiculous, or the tool is broken that they're using. And so people will say, oh, the word religious wasn't used at a certain period in time. That just is probably OCR errors. So I agree with you, garbage in, garbage out thinking. And I do think digital humanists need to be, we're so excited to use these tools, but we need to be more aware that they really can't work if we don't tend to them properly. Any other questions or thoughts? So Sandra, I'm just fascinated by your talk because it seems to me that that all of us are feeling kind of hopeless about fake news and feeling like there is no legal recourse. And so you have a whole list of things that can happen. And I did notice the CNN banning of the Trump ad. And that's right. You fact check. If you fact check, you can prevent things from being broadcast, which is amazing. But can't they claim, well, we just want to advertise, it's an advertisement, so it's not a news item, so Facticity doesn't apply?
Actually, under U.S. law, you can lie in politics, but you can't lie in an ad. And so that's what I was saying. In the Federal Trade Commission, any claim, any assertion of fact that you offer in an ad, you have to have rigorous scientific evidence beforehand, before you distribute the ad. supporting it. So if you say, gets it done in 5 seconds instead of 10, you have to have research on that. Whereas, so basically, right, you can lie about healthcare, but not about your toothpaste.
My God, that's amazing. So there is all kinds of recourse, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I've been very surprised because obviously dozens and dozens of people are now writing about this, including out of law school environments. I was recently at an event that was co-hosted by Harvard and Northeastern Law School, and they didn't even touch on the legal questions. So there's an interesting aspect of multiple and cross-disciplinarity here. I was very interested to hear the English professor have such interesting things to say about the quality of data, and the legal scholars are thinking about the sociology of the consumption of fake news, but there is the legal argument to be made yet. And I must confess that given the pressing political issues, I have restructured my own writing program so I can address this sooner.
Here's a question here for you, Sandra, as well.
Thank you. Becca, the question about Communications Decency Act excusing platforms from content responsibility, but platforms are like the Internet Service Provider or Facebook. They aren't completely exempt. So, for example, they're still responsible for copyright infringement without legal determination. Somebody can just assert that their copyright has been infringed, and the platform has to take it down. So it's not complete protection, but there's a difference between holding the platform responsible and the content provider responsible. So the examples I was giving were all things that you would go after the content provider for. So if somebody is viciously and deliberately involved in a campaign, a fake news campaign that uses Facebook, say, you wouldn't go after Facebook, but you can still go after the people who are producing the content. They would be the subjects of the legal charges, not the platform.
So we have time for one more question. I just wanted to ask Heidi. Heidi, your presentation on religious memes was fascinating, and we've all heard lots of discourse on how Twitter flattens our understanding of things because of 140 characters. Memes are even more limited in their length. Do you see memes as in any way rendering religious debates more divisive because more sort of stereotyped and reductive?
I think because memes often, produced by people outside the community as forms of, and they may be thinking that they're being playful, but, just as we saw like in the Danish cartoon controversy about, a decade ago, that obviously how things are read from a religious context, there's a lot of cultural, historical, and kind of ritual-based kind of constraints in which how people interpret things. So I think when it comes to memes, because they're functioning on humor, they're functioning on reductionist principles. And so religion, you're not getting the full picture, and that's the problem. Is especially when we're looking at religion and politics, it says it's trying to give people think, oh, this is how the whole community believes. It's equating ISIS with Islam, it's equating with Westboro Baptist with all of Christianity, and I think nuance. Because we can't find out who the authors are, gets lost, and that's where a lot of where it goes from being playful to being harmful or problematic.
Great. I guess we do have time for one more question. We have 5 minutes, so I'll just take a look here. Here is a question from Jeff Rockwell.
To Heidi?
To Heidi. What role does LOL?
I don't know what that is.
Oh, the lolcats playing memes.
Oh, yeah.
Fake memes. Well, I obviously LOL is one of the kind of genres of kind of mainstream kind of memes, and the lolcats has been used kind of to talk about religion as well as politics, to talk about economics, education, as well as kind of the latest fashion style. I think, LOLs, they're meant to be, again, more in that playful genre, and so Schiffman would say they can be used in much more kind of productive ways, maybe, and where some genres, such as kind of, like Religion Pigeon and Vice God, the main aim is to critique and to mock. So some meme genres I think are ones that could be encouraged as better tools for conversations than others.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But can I ask Heidi, when we think about lulls, they're also engaged in things like DDoS attacks and other kinds of things that really do cause damage to networks and systems. So does that change how you would think about their use of memes?
I think that, obviously it's kind of a double-edged sword that there's some genres that are they're easier because of their nature to be used, but that doesn't mean that they are used in productive ways. Yeah, because, Anonymous has been key with kind of circulating and replicating a lot of memes in ways that have been problematic and encouraging kind of, stereotyping and especially kind of hate discourse.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming to the IDHMC from wherever you are. We really enjoyed presenting the panel to you, and we will pass back to Jeffrey so that you can go on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.